making your asset plan, which is a 20-year investment decision based on a positive, rosy 5-year cycle, that can be the death of your company. When the shit hit the fan and a mistake was made, I stood up and said, I'm responsible. Maersk chose the high road. We wanted to go for hydrogen instead of LNG. That was also a choice not made with the wallet. It was a choice made with the heart.
The top 10 container shipping line control more than 85% of global capacity. How did this industry become so concentrated? Strong leaders with strong values built a global organization that can thrive throughout those volatile years. They did that either through merger and acquisition or organic growth. One such company is AP Moller-Maersk, or simply known as Maersk, which has become a leader in container shipping throughout its 121 years of proud history. Meet Robbert van Trooijen, ex-Maersk president for Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Throughout his career, he lived through two very different M&A. One as the one being acquired in the case of P&O Nedlloyd, another one as the acquirer for Hamburg Süd. We also reviewed the track record of Maersk in decarbonization, integrated logistics, and digitalization. What are the lessons we can learn? At the time of recording, we had an issue with the video feed, so today the episode will be voice only. Let's dive right in. Today it's my pleasure to have Robbert van Trooijen on the Schelling point. Robbert used to be the regional CEO of Maersk Asia Pacific after a long career at Maersk. How are you doing, Robbert?
I'm doing very well, Bertrand, and thanks for inviting me.
Like most of the episodes, I'd like to start with the beginning. And in your case, what is your first memory of shipping?
Well, I should say that my father was already involved in ocean shipping way before I was born. He was a ship's officer sailing on merchant navy vessels for about 8 years. So looking at the picture books, I saw every place that he has been, and that was a big inspiration to me. So for me, it was always destined that I would be involved in something international, and I was happy to be able to join shipping and logistics business as a career.
I think you studied first a Bachelor of Commerce and Economics, right?
That's correct. I studied a bachelor's degree in commerce and economics, and I also did some logistic training as well at the time. So it was very clear that that was going to be my destiny. And actually, when I joined the military service, I also became an officer in the logistic corps, so I could understand the military logistics as well. So it was sort of in my blood.
Yeah, I think people don't understand, but wars are won or lost on logistics. So probably the most important part of the military. So when you first started at NedLloyd, I think you joined as a management trainee, right? You couple rotation. What are the department where you went, and how did that first few years shape up?
Yeah, so as a student in studying in Rotterdam, NedLloyd is a big employer in that area with a big building in the center of town. And I applied and I got in. So as a management trainee, you rotate. So you have to do 3 different projects over a period of time. And my first project was on the road cargo division, because NedLloyd was a bit like a conglomerate, a bit like Maersk later on. It had oil and gas business, it had drilling business, it had inland distribution, distribution centers, warehousing, etc. So I started in the road cargo division, which ran a network of trucking lines across Europe on fixed daily departures, I should say. And my first task was in HR, in the HR department, where I had to do some job grading. And from there, I went to the business planning department, where we looked at the quality of these trunk lines, on-time delivery already in those days. And then from there, my last project was in the shipping division in NedLloyd Lines, which was my ultimate goal to work there. And we looked at the strategic planning cycles in liner shipping and what we could do better there.
Explain a bit in the strategy, the planning department. Typically, what's your job? You plan for the next 5 years, next 10 years of the strategy of the shipping line?
Yeah, so in those days, I think the strategy was 1992 to 1997. So always a 5-year deadline. And you look at your growth rates, your GDP development globally, and in specific markets. You look at your expected conversion of GDP to container trade to see what demand is going to do over the next couple of years. You look at your capacity planning, and obviously you look at your financial projections, which the board would ask for. I was a trainee and a starting manager, so I was in a very limited junior role, but I was still great to see how that process took place in a company like that. And of course, it was the liner shipping division strategy, which had to be incorporated in the total group strategy. Because as I said, the NedLloyd group in those days was also oil and gas and logistics and distribution centers, etc.
Right. Actually, one question, I was fascinated by strategy. What is the biggest mistake for a strategy department?
Oof, that's a tough question. Of course, there are many. But the one thing I would always recommend is not to take one case as your strategy. There should always be a low case and a high case and a likely case, particularly in the world of shipping, which, as we know, is extremely cyclical. The difference between a high case and a low case can be substantial. And making your asset plan, which is a 20-year investment decision if you order new ships based on a maybe a bit positive, rosy 5-year cycle, that can be the death of your company if you run out of cash. So this is a very important part of the strategy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think that's the same way the traders are trained in the sense that you need to plan, best case, base case, and worst case. You need to be ready to take the actions. And as long as you have a plan, then you can sleep at night. Otherwise, the volatility is so high sometimes in the market, you cannot handle the risk. And then I think in 2005, so by that time you've been in NedLloyd for how many years? For 10 years already? Or
No more, 16. I started in 1990, so
16 years?
15 years, 15 years.
15 years, okay. Maersk acquired P&O NedLloyd, right? So how did that affect your career trajectory in the sense that it's merger of two companies, right? Different culture?
Actually, for me, I mean, there was no way of knowing that, but for me, it was a very positive development. I happened to be in the right role at the right place at the right time in P&O Nedlloyd. I had just been promoted to headquarters to be one of the senior leaders and the head of network planning as a director. So I got engaged with Maersk early on in the integration of the network, where I represented P&O Nedlloyd on the network side, together with a group of colleagues, of course. And I met nearly all of the senior leaders in that sense, and I managed to land a great role from day one in the department. Of course, it was a very stressful time, but it was a great learning experience. I managed to put my team together, including a lot of P&O Nedlloyd colleagues that joined the department. So it worked out very well in my case.
And then would you say the management style or way to do things with at P&O Nedlloyd and Maersk, is it similar for the network planning? Or do you think there was a pace of adaptation between the two?
Yeah, so overall, I would say that Maersk was a very process-oriented company. There was standard operating procedures for just about everything, and in P&O Nedlloyd, it was a bit more commercial, sometimes a bit more ad hoc. I would also say in those days maybe a bit more customer-centric. In terms of network planning, as I said, P&O Nedlloyd was used to always work in collaboration with other carriers. So every service that P&O Nedlloyd had was a collaboration with different shipping lines, so-called vessel sharing agreements, where you essentially, it's a bit like code sharing in the airline business. You supply half the vessels for a service, your alliance partner provides the other half, and that is a joint service. So all the technicalities of that, how these agreements are put together, how the liabilities are put together, what the responsibilities are, that was a bit more familiar to P&O Nedlloyd than it was to Maersk. So suddenly Maersk engaged in a very large number of collaborations, and a lot of the knowledge was actually used from P&O Nedlloyd on how to operate these VSAs. It's not to say that Maersk didn't operate any VSAs before that, but not to that scale. Maersk was much more independent than P&O Nedlloyd was.
Hey, Zach in your editing room here. I realize that 76.8% of you have not yet subscribed to the Schelling Point. If you could just hit the subscribe button down below, it will really help us out and keep producing content like this. Thank you. Now back to the Schelling Point.
I see. So for your perspective, it was you will bring something to the table that Maersk didn't have as much, right? The knowledge of how to negotiate, how to operationalize those VSA.
We
Because
as a,
it's
co-
not
we,
just
we
about
as a company,
your own
not so
process.
much myself,
Yeah.
not so much myself, but we as a company, definitely.
I see. And that's why also that gives the value of your team. You were able to bring new way of doing things that maybe they didn't embrace as much as before. And then was there like a very structured process for Maersk to do the integration?
Very structured and very keen also on the cultural integration. Because the values had just been rolled out within Maersk through senior management, and all of the senior leaders that joined from P&O Nedlloyd were trained in those values as well. And those are the values that the founder or the son of the founder, Maersk McKinney Miller, had dictated to senior leadership before he retired. So that was very much there. I think in terms of interest, there was certainly an interest in the system side of things, because P&O Nedlloyd had just rolled out a enterprise resource planning system. Maersk was still not in a position to do that. So in terms of how yield management was done, how enterprise resource planning was done in these systems, I think it was PeopleSoft in those days. There was a
I
keen
see.
interest from Maersk to understand how did that work, how do you use it, how do you do optimization, yield management planning, etc. So that interest was there. But as always with an acquisition, the acquiring party dictates the future. So Maersk obviously was in charge of dictating what the system's choice would be and how the organizational model would work.
I'm fascinated by that question, but what were they using if they were not using ERP?
No,
How were they doing the planning?
there was a range of legacy systems, many legacy systems that were designed earlier and that were used. There was a modernization effort taking place. But at that time, I think it's safe to say that on ERP systems, P&O NedLloyd was a bit ahead of Maersk.
I see. So they were basically cobbled together as opposed to more monolithic kind of design, which is more centralized one.
Yes, it was very centralized global systems, but definitely designed in the 80s, sort of green screen systems that were bolted
I see.
onto one another with a
I
very
see.
elaborate systems architecture. I'm not an IT
I see.
expert, but that's what the perception that I got.
No. That's very interesting. Because I think the perception now is, from an IT perspective, is probably one of the leader in the market around all the investment they've made in digital. But it's interesting to hear that in 2005, actually, they were looking at NedLloyd for your experience with PeopleSoft and some of the modern ERP. Okay, and I think in 2017, Maersk acquired Hamburg Süd, and then in 2021, you were appointed as a chairman of Hamburg Süd. So you were on the other side of the integration, almost like 16 years after you were on the other side. So how was that experience for you? Now you're the acquirer. You've learned the value of Maersk.
Actually, it was a good experience from my perspective. I will say that it was commonly understood that the P&O NedLloyd integration was not an integration that was very well done. In hindsight, synergy deliverables were not achieved, etc. So, before acquiring Hamburg Süd, the CEO came around to ex-P&O NedLloyd colleagues and said, amongst others, "What was your experience? What can we learn from that so that we avoid making a similar mistake when we acquire Hamburg Süd?" And there was a long document that was drawn up that I participated in that drew up some lessons. So when approaching Hamburg Süd, actually, the first decision, which was, I think, a great decision, is we're not going to touch anything until we understand what the secret sauce of Hamburg Süd is. Because, of course, when you make an acquisition, it's very limited under competition law what you're allowed to see. You can only see stuff after you've closed the transaction. So in those days, after closing a transaction, the decision was taken, Hamburg Süd will run by itself. Basically, there will be some integration done on vessels and network, etc. But commercially, they will run as a separate brand. And we're going to learn what made Hamburg Süd so successful, because Hamburg Süd was a tremendously successful shipping line, very customer-centric, very close to the customer, very strong positions in certain trades. So Maersk said, we need to understand what that is before we start messing with it. And that was the reason that Hamburg Süd was kept standalone for a long period of time, which was very different from P&O NedLloyd or Sealand, which were instant integrations. The day of closure was basically the first day of integration. A different approach then was taken with Hamburg Süd.
But now I think the two brands are folding under Maersk, right? So it took maybe what, 5 years, 6 years
Correct.
to understand and to decide what to keep?
The integration was finalized after I left the company in 2023. And it was not the only integration that was done, because Sealand was also a separate brand run under the Maersk umbrella. And that was also integrated at the same time. So the monolithic brand, as it was called, going to one brand from all these different brands, that was very much the implementation that happened in 2023. But I wasn't there anymore for that, because I left the company in February 2000.
So would you define the core value of Hamburg Süd that made them successful is the customer centricity, and then the way they build the service around that? That's what made them unique.
Yeah, Hamburg Süd had the slogan "By your side," which in Hamburg Süd's case was actually the case. You had people who had been in the same role for decades, who knew the customer inside out, who were on speed dial with these customers, who went out of their way to solve problems. And that was what made Hamburg Süd so successful until this day.
I see. Okay. So you were both sides of the integration on the receiving end and the giving the integration. In the last few years, I think that there has been many uncertainty, right? The most difficult task people are solving is probably this tension between US and China and the decoupling. Most recently, a few weeks, you have even more tension escalating between the US and China with the rare earth and other subjects. You were regional CEO of Maersk Asia Pac during 2015-2020. So the first wave of the US-China tension that was kicked off in Trump first term. How did that impact the market at that point, if you recall, like 2016, 2017, I think, right?
Correct. So let me start by saying that in those days, actually, the trade war, as it was called, was much more surgical than it is today. It was much more targeted on certain commodities, on certain origins, etc. It was less across the board than it is today. But in compensation, you didn't get this back and forth, do it, not do it, that we see today. Today, I have to say, if you want to know what goes on with the trade war, you have to read the newspaper every day, because every day there's a decision, it's taken back, it's re-implemented, it's made worse, it's made better. We didn't have that in 2016, 2017. It was clear what it was, and it was consistent. But the impact was significant. There were several impacts. First of all, is an integrated logistics business. There was impacts on the load factors of the vessels, because obviously, certainly in the initial period where it was uncertain how things would develop, the cargo was kept back by the shippers to say, I'm going to see how this goes before I start shipping again. So we had a lot of empty space on the vessels in those days. And secondly, because we were a logistic operator as well, we did a lot of CFS, container freight station operations for these clients. We were running their supply chains through our systems in those days. So there also you could feel the impact of the lower trade volumes, both on the utilization of our landside infrastructure and our supply chain management systems that were running the client's supply chain, particularly on the retail side. You could see the difference in revenue coming in there. And then, of course, also you had a renminbi devaluation versus the dollar, which is actually not the case today, where you could see that the local income in renminbi, of course, if your revenue is reported in dollars and your income is in renminbi, you could feel the impact of the exchange rate loss on your budget. Of course, you could say it's an artificial measure, but still, we felt that very much when you have a dollar target and your income is in renminbi. That's a tough one.
So I think you stress the difference between that time and this time. It was more painful to some degree, but you had time to plan because the strategy was rolled consistently over a certain period. Right now, it's just it's a yo-yo. It goes up and down. Basically, it's impossible to plan effectively. What's your view on the future decoupling between US and China? How that potentially will shape up for the supply chain? Because I think right now that it's clear that you start to have some negotiation that's more or less finalized with some country, but the US-China is still a big question.
Yeah, first, let me start with another comparison to those days. Obviously, there and also in the start of COVID, there was a big transition of cargo origin from China to Southeast Asia. But it was very clear that places like Vietnam couldn't possibly handle all of the additional volume simply because the production capacity was not there and the infrastructure wasn't ready to manage all of this. This is partly COVID, partly trade war, but those elements played a big role there. Obviously, since then, Southeast Asia has made significant investment in additional infrastructure. So nowadays, you see that some shift has taken place from China into Southeast Asia of production capacity. I will say that it's going to be very difficult for any destination market to replace China in any big way. As we saw in those days, even like 5 or 10% of Chinese production moving into Southeast Asia was already complete chaos on the logistics side. So I foresee that one cannot be without the other. That is also clear. And let's face it, it's not just the US, it's also Europe and other markets. China is such a big factor in the global production and the global supply chain that I don't see a future in which China is replaced or in which there's 100% tariff simply because it's shooting yourself in the foot. As the US, you will damage your own economy significantly if you cut trade with China altogether. And I don't see that. Plus, you see it going both ways, right? You see that China has effectively replaced the soybeans and sorghum that was imported from the US. Now looking at Brazil, you can also see that Brazil holds 25% of the global rare earth deposits. So over time, of course, there are different alternatives to these trade relations, but never to the tune that you can discard or decouple completely. I think that's just something that is not likely to happen. And I think everybody realizes that. And that's why I said it's very difficult to plan, because every day there's a new announcement. And this is just, in my view, positioning towards a negotiation position. This is not something that is seriously being planned.
So you're saying it's probably we're looking at a US-China deal where tariff will be much lower, or at least a path for coexistence between the two blocks effectively, where you'll have a more workable path. Cannot just have like 150% tariff as
No,
is being established right now.
that is unworkable. And it's also, I think, the learning for both sides is that something that was seen as insignificant by one party is actually seen as significant by the other. There was the famous agreement made in or was it in Spain, that was referred to by both parties, and then both parties said that certain steps were taken to violate the terms of that agreement, which is what triggered the reaction. China claims that by declaring certain companies blacklisted was a violation of that agreement, and therefore they restricted rare earth. Yes. So everything has a reason, and every event has a logical response to it. So as long as people can realize that there are unintended consequences to every decision, I think it's clear.
Right. I understand that when COVID first hit, you were in China. Can you give us a sense of how was the experience for you guys?
Yeah, so anecdotally, and this is interesting, the week that, as you know, COVID broke out in Wuhan first, in Hubei province, and I
Yeah.
happened to be in the Governor's Advisory Council meeting in Wuhan the week it broke out. So I was actually very close to the epicenter of COVID at the very moment that it broke out. Of course, it didn't break out at the governor's convention, but it broke out somewhere in Wuhan at that same time. Then, of course, the first impact we felt was that the workers could not return to the factory. So production was significantly impacted. And that, of course, had an immediate impact, the same way that the trade war had an immediate impact on both stuffing of cargo in the CFSs, in the container freight stations, and the vessel sailings. So that was very much a very traumatic and stressful impact, not just on business, but of course the fact that that COVID was so severe. So that was certainly a big experience for us.
Yeah. But how did that help you also for the planning of on the receiving end on the LATAM and Caribbean? What action to take? Because you've seen actually some of the early warnings compared to other people who were not actually as much based in China.
Yeah, so we arrived in Panama from Hong Kong mid 2020. And at that point in time, all the COVID measures were already in force across the whole region. Cargo kept flowing, cargo kept moving. And in fact, as you know, consumption of products increased dramatically because people could not go out to have dinner in restaurants. So they spent all the money on stuff from China. So the ships were full, but we could not travel. But the physical flow of cargo, the ports, how they operated vessels, they continued flowing. One of the big challenges, of course, was that the crews could not be disembarking when they should. So there were crews who stayed on the vessel for much longer than they normally would. And we found a chance by sheer luck to evacuate. We as a company, not me personally, but to evacuate crews and send them back home earlier, because otherwise these crews would have stayed way too long on the vessel. But the whole COVID period, as you probably know, for liner shipping and for logistics was a very profitable period. I'm sad to say, but certainly the way to operate was definitely different.
Yeah, I think the last few years, right? It has been one disruption after the other. Another one I think that also impacting right now is the Houthis, right? The Red Sea, and that crisis still hasn't been resolved. I understand previously you were dealing also with the Somali pirates in the late 2000, like 2008, 2009. Like, can you explain a bit, like from a shipping line perspective, how do you handle this kind of risk? What are the operation measures that you have in place continuously when you have to deal with this kind of situation?
So when the Somali pirates were there, I was based in Dubai. I was in charge of the Middle East and South Asia, so I was very close to the action. Certainly in those days, the convoys were accompanied by Navy vessels to protect them, but the Somalis were primarily attacking through small vessels that were sailing towards the big vessels. Both with the Houthis and with the Somalis, to hijack a vessel, the most vulnerable ones are vessels with a low board, where it's easy to board the vessel, and the vessel that can't go very fast. big container vessels in terms of piracy, big container vessels can speed up to 22, 23 knots, and then you cannot catch them. But the smaller ones, they don't have the capacity to go that fast. And because they are lower on the water, they are more vulnerable to piracy attacks. From what I understand, the Houthi approach is not necessarily the same. They also have missiles and they approach things in a different way. But I do know that if and when that is resolved, and presumably it's resolved when peace in the Middle East has resumed and Iran and the US can see eye to eye, then it's not necessarily, it's a safer environment for shipping lines, but it's also a very vulnerable time for shipping lines because, as you must know, more than 1/3 of the existing container fleet is currently on order to be built. And that is capacity that is not needed because there is no demand for it. So that is going to impact. And that's happened before. That situation also happened. And it took the industry a decade, 10 years to absorb that additional capacity. And in the meantime, freight rates reduced significantly. I am sure that it's not a mystery when I say that that is likely to repeat itself in the next 5 years. So we're going to see another environment where the industry is going through a deep trough in terms of profitability after having since 2019 to now 5, 6, 7 years of extreme profitability. So the cash is there to sustain a downturn like that, but it may have other triggers in the industry that were long overdue, but were not necessarily executed at that time.
Can you describe also for people who are not familiar, why do you have this dynamic where it's like the good years and bad years? Why the shipping line just over order so much ships when they could just say, let's order less?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily because demand changes so dramatically, but because you do have cycles in demand where it's a little bit less and a little bit more. But when you order a vessel, that is a decision you take for 20 years. So it's impossible to react to changes in demand by ordering new vessels simply because it takes too long. It takes 2 years to get a vessel delivered if you order it today. So you have to anticipate what demand is going to do. And collectively, of course, you can say that shipping lines should be more diligent when ordering vessels, but individually, they will say that's someone else's problem. So if you look today at those who are ordering vessels, people keep ordering. And some carriers are very successful in filling that capacity no matter how many ships they order. And they will say, you know what, I have the cash to sustain this level. I don't have shareholders because I'm privately owned. So I don't have a market to please or a shareholder to please. I can sustain this. And others have to justify their profitability to a market or to a shareholder because they are listed companies. So those who are in private hands, where the owner says, I'm willing to have zero return for 3 to 5 years to make myself the biggest on the planet or close to the biggest, they have a different approach to things. But it's always been over order, under order. Some will argue that right before COVID, there was not enough on order. So COVID was partly so profitable because there was no capacity to sustain all this additional demand. Hence the reaction to order vessels.
From your description, it sounds like if you run a shipping line, you shouldn't be a listed company. You shouldn't have a public shareholder to explain your decision. Because if you are privately owned, you can take more longer term position. You can potentially, let's say, buy low and sell high instead of buy high and sell low. You said, right? The demand is like it's a 20-year investment, and sometimes you just have to make it. Close your eyes and make it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're a private owner, it helps the speed of decision making, but it also makes it more difficult to access capital markets when you need them, right? If you are a very rich private owner who can self-fund your expansion, then it's good. If you're not so rich and you need loans or bank financing or whatever, or equity injections, and you're not listed, that is more difficult. So I guess it's good to be private if you're rich.
Yes, like usual. Okay, let's move on to what's fascinating also, the transformation I think Maersk has had over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, right? You were not anymore at Maersk, but you were at least certainly a witness of some of the transformation. I think the biggest transformation probably is the positioning from Maersk as an ocean carrier to become more integrated logistic provider for the last 10 years, I would say. And I think you called in the past, it's a state of mind. Can you describe a bit how did that strategy came to be? Why did Maersk make that decision?
So let me start by saying, and this is a common misconception, many people say Maersk started in logistics 10 years ago. Actually, that is not correct. Maersk started with buyers consolidation in the 1980s in a company called, in those days it was called Mercantile. Mercantile became Maersk Logistics. Maersk Logistics became Damco when Damco, the freight forwarding business, was acquired with P&O Nedlloyd. Maersk has been in logistics for decades. Some people say Maersk is now into air freight. Maersk has operated, actually, it used to own an airline, and for the last 20 years has operated something like 16 Boeing 767 freighters, but they were chartered out to FedEx and UPS, I think it is, out of Cologne. So Maersk has a lot of experience with logistics, but it operated it a little bit like CMA and CEVA are separate, and a little bit like Medlog and MSC are separate. Maersk has taken the decision to be integrated because it says, I don't want to have 6 people calling on the same customer. One for ocean freight, one for contract logistics, one for air freight, one for customized brokerage. I would like to have one face to the customer that may not be an expert in all of it, but manages the customer relationship and meets the customer needs. And then when it becomes very technical about designing a new warehouse or specific customized brokerage questions, you can call in the expert. So that has been the strategy change when Damco was reintegrated, I think in 2018, and all of the regions became co-responsible for ocean shipping and logistics. The idea is to have an integrated sales force that manages the customer from an end-to-end perspective and, of course, tries to serve the customer from an end-to-end perspective. That's the difference, I would say.
No, that definitely sounds very attractive and makes a lot of sense logically, right? I just want one single person to ask questions if something goes wrong and to handle everything for me. That definitely makes sense, both also for user experience, but also for cost perspective. However, I'm sure there's also challenges, right? So what are the challenges to implement this strategy?
Well, of course, the question on the integrated sales force also means that you need to have a certain level of expertise in there. And I think for a person with an ocean shipping background to understand logistics is not easy because it's a different world, and vice versa. So
Yeah.
that's number one. Number two, certainly in my personal experience, and I don't speak on behalf of Maersk, I want to make that very clear. It's not always the same person that deals with ocean shipping and that deals with contract logistics. So while it's the same client, that it is different. What I will say is that when you talk supply chain management, you speak to the chief supply chain officer. When you talk ocean shipping, you usually speak to the ocean procurement manager. So I found the discussions on logistics to be much more around value, and the discussions around ocean shipping tend to migrate very quickly to, and I'm really paraphrasing here, if I give you more volume, will you give me a lower rate? Which is a discussion on procurement. It's not necessarily a very value-based discussion. That's also why I think it's so important, and then I can only applaud what Maersk has accomplished in terms of schedule reliability, because the moment that your reliability of your shipment arriving is above 90%, you can start looking at where can I save cost in my supply chain. When reliability is hovering around 50, 60%, you need to keep a buffer stock everywhere. You need to keep a buffer stock at origin, at your regional distribution hubs, at the final factory to have make sure that production is not disrupted. The moment you achieve 90% plus ocean reliability or end-to-end reliability, you start to have a different discussion. And that's also where I think the combination of logistics and shipping has been so important for Maersk. And that is, I think, sometimes different than the mindset if you work in a pure ocean shipping company, where it's essentially port to port or maybe door to door, but certainly not thinking of inventory levels and buffer stocks and the supply chain in that way.
I agree 100%. I think for container shipping, it's such an important industry. However, the mindset is just boils down to 2 parameters, rates and availability. But actually, the service that really the customer needs is much more complicated than that, right? It's a supply chain. Now, the question obviously is how do you combine these services together? Even though if, let's say, Maersk can provide that service, maybe the clients organize differently. So that's also a journey that they also have to go, where they don't treat the shipping line as undifferentiated.
There will always be an ocean shipping tender, and there will always be a warehouse tender, and there will always be a customized brokerage tender. It's not going to be one big combined tender where you bid for all products. And as long as that is the case, these will be separate negotiations. But I think it's good if you look at the combined value that you present for a client. They may say, I want to give my warehousing business to the party that also carries my cargo because I want to have one throat to choke. So something goes wrong. And that's a little bit what you see today if everything is split, is that everybody's pointing fingers to someone else. It's the forwarder pointing fingers to the shipping line. It's the shipping line pointing fingers to the trucker. It's the trucker pointing fingers to the port, so saying the gate was not ready, etc. If you have all of those in one hand, as a client, you can say, I don't care. You are end-to-end accountable. You find out where the problem is and solve it for me. So that's the value of an integrated service. You can either say one throat to choke or one shoulder to pat on, right? When it goes well.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's it's an interesting direction. And I think so far right now, at least financially, the result still hasn't performed to the expectation, I think, of the board.
What I hear in the public figures is that it's improving. As a logistics business, of course, the bar is high. The bar is high because you're compared to DSV and to Kuehne Nagel on your logistics portfolio, and then maybe 6% return is not what they get. They could probably get closer to 10. So that's something that's also to be taken into account.
Yeah. So another thing also about the Maersk strategy over the last 10 years is store transformation. The reason actually I kind of joined GSBN, was interested in the project, was because Maersk and IBM started another project called TradeLens. Late 2022 was announced, they shut down. So what was ultimately the reason didn't meet the objective that Maersk had initially when they started the project?
Yeah, so TradeLens was a separate organization within the group led by my colleague Mike White. So I can't say I was directly involved in TradeLens. Of course, I knew what was going on, and we discussed it in the board, in the Ocean Management Board various times. But I think eventually TradeLens may not have succeeded because of lack of trust, I would say. There were different parties involved. They all had a keen interest to see blockchain technology being used to handle the transaction. But there were all these stakeholders, and they were all thinking, what's in it for me? Who owns it in the end of the day? Who will make sure that the data is handled neutrally? Which are all questions of trust. I think as an innovation, Maersk was, as usual, way ahead of its time, and was actually one of the founders of that movement, which still goes on today, right? If you look at what DCSA is doing, those are relationships that were settled during the days of TradeLens. And ultimately, that must happen. The fact that you still have paper communication in any way, shape, or form, be it letters of credit, that's archaic. That has to disappear. So TradeLens has triggered some of that change movement that we're still taking advantage of today in the industry. It's a shame that it didn't materialize the way it was hoped, because in essence, it was a really far ahead of its time and really good idea.
No, I would agree 100%. I think there is also a tremendous investment in energy and time. And I think at the time of shutdown, the network that was built was massive. Like number of terminal, depot that was involved in the network. It was really impressive. Right? It's unfortunate that, I think, as you said, it's more of a governance, trust, business model failure rather than technology. Definitely a solution that was building is needed, right? Another thing that Maersk also was leading, and I think last week was a bad week for this subject, is sustainability. So last week, the IMO net zero framework kind of took a detour to delay by at least 1 year to pass the global carbon tax. But Maersk has been, I think, over the last 5-6 years, a massive supporter for decarbonization. And I've actually interacted with your colleagues in China, who are signing very ambitious offtake agreement with a green fuel producer in Mongolia. Can you give us a sense of what is the thought process?
So for me, from what I remember, decarbonization was an agenda that was managed at the highest level. This was not just the group, but also the Maersk family personally having a
Yep.
keen interest in decarbonization. So this was
Yep.
not something that was left to everybody to figure out for themselves. It was known already then that supply might be an issue of green hydrogen, and there was a big effort to go around and say, I'll sign a 10-year offtake agreement with you, which you can take to the bank, and then you can invest in the production. I'm happy to do that. I think that is happening, and I wasn't aware of the deal in China, but that sounds like one of those deals has succeeded. Maersk has a string of vessels that is methanol ready. So I'm sure Maersk will continue on the path that it's in, but carriers need a level playing field. You can't go around by yourself doing this, increasing your cost base when nobody else is playing by the same rules. So it's unfortunate. It seems to be part of a bigger wave to step away from environmental considerations, because it's not just the shipping dynamic. It's happening across many geographies, including the USA, where everything that was environmental is being shelved. So it's not a surprise that IMO would also struggle to find consensus. But it's a setback for sure, because there's a commitment to do it in 1 year. There's a commitment to look at it again in 1 year, as far as I understand, which is not the outcome we all hoped would happen.
I think in this space, Maersk has been a real leader over the last few years, right? With some of the product eco delivery that they offer, and also the dual engine ship. They were, I think, the first one to order with sufficient scale, and then increasingly because the first order from Maersk, it made it actually economical also to build those for the other shipping lines. So, but as you said, right, at the end of the day, Maersk cannot just put themselves in the worst position from an economic perspective if the rates going to be more expensive because they commit to a higher burden in terms of green fuels.
Yeah, and I would also say that Maersk chose the high road, which because many others chose LNG, which is still carbon based. So Maersk said, "Listen, yes, it's less polluting than heavy fuel, but still it's carbon based. So we wanted to go for hydrogen instead of LNG." So that was also a choice not made with the wallet; it was a choice made with the heart, which I think is very important in these matters.
Yeah, I would say that over the last 10 years, more of decision, the couple things that we talked about, right? In TradeLens, decarbonization, integrated, it's more kind of a trailblazing decision that's not backed by numbers necessarily, but more the right thing to do. Would you say that's actually how typically the decisions are made at Maersk side?
Obviously, there's always a calculator in the room when these decisions are taking place. But there are many decisions like pulling out of Russia. That was not a decision made with the calculator. That was a decision made out of principle. When nobody else was doing it, they already said we will no longer do this. There's a calculated decision, but there's also something driven by values. And the Maersk values are very strong, and many of those decisions were values driven rather than financial or back pocket driven.
I see. And I guess you were really trained in the headquarters in Copenhagen, the value of Maersk. You led team across different culture, different region for Maersk, right? What's your philosophy? How do you adapt those values to your style of leadership?
So the first thing that I realized early on in my career is that you come with a cultural baggage that comes from your home country, and everything you see through that cultural lens. And you have to stop yourself to say, this is how things work where I came from, because you're not where you came from. And many people
Yeah.
in different geographies have done things differently, but equally or more successfully than you have. So the first lesson that I've tried to keep in mind is learn from them first. Learn from the teams around you, learn what made them successful, and then see whether you can help them be even more successful in their own way. So I've learned to be much more reflective and much more observant on the success of others when it comes to that. Because as you said, 15 years Asia Pacific, 15 years Latin America, 3 years Middle East,
Yeah.
very different styles, very different things.
Yeah.
The only thing where I've always drawn a line is around ethics and leadership behavior. Now, there is a red line of things you do and do not do, the way you treat other people, the way you handle people with respect, which is also a core Maersk
Yeah.
value. And I've always tried to do that in the best way possible. I'm sure I've made mistakes, but that's always been my goal, working in such different geographical parts of the world.
And I guess those values are universal technically, right? It doesn't matter if you are in China or in Middle East or in Latam. The value we're talking about, those ethic lines is universal. It's not, there's a difference in those regions for ethics, right? So
Yeah, but it's very important to see, because it's always gray, right? There's always it's not exactly against, but it's also not exactly in line. So it's where you have the gray areas where you need to make that line for yourself to interpret what is the spirit of the values that we work with. What did the founder have
Yeah.
in mind when he thought of those values, and you act accordingly. That's called living the values.
Yeah. Let me ask a question this way then. What legacy do you want to leave on the people that you've trained, that you've managed, and that you've led, mentored over the last, let's say, 20, 30 years?
Well, first of all, I've had the blessing of working with extremely capable people that have all succeeded to amazing levels. If there's anything that I want to be remembered by, is when the shit hit the fan and a mistake was made, I stood up and said, I'm responsible. We've taken risks in the past, risks that were of course calculated, but risks that you're always, you're sticking your neck out for something. And I've always hoped to protect those who worked with me, for me, from feeling that I had their back when they took that risk. I've worked with leaders in my past that when the shit hit the fan, they were nowhere to be found. And I always thought and then you create leaders that will never take a risk again. So I've always said,
Yeah.
when something didn't work out as planned, I'm here. I approved this. I put my signature on that piece of paper. I'm with you all the way. And we learn from this and we move on and we try to improve. But I am more responsible even than whoever else signed on that dotted line. And that for me was such a crucial leadership lesson, that You take risks and you take them in the knowledge that if the shit hits the fan, if it goes bad, then we are all in it together.
That's actually very consistent with your love for shipping, right? Basically, what you're saying, you're the captain of the ship, right? If you have to be responsible, you're the last one to leave the ship. Otherwise, people won't trust you and they never be able to perform as a team. You know that if they screw up, the trust is there, and then you work together to solve the problem also.
Yeah, and we even, and this sounds very unorthodox, but we even invited someone to say, you know what, when we meet as a regional team, please make a presentation on what you learned. And this is very awkward and very uncomfortable because somebody has to elaborate on what went wrong. But we always made them feel that this is a learning for all of us because it could have happened to any one of us. And we need to learn from this to help us all be better.
Actually, this, if you think about it logically, this is the right approach because you can view that the people who made the mistake, they pay the tuition fee already to learn what not to do. And you would want them to internalize it and to tell everyone, don't make the same mistake. As opposed to if you don't encourage people to share this, then you just keep making the same mistake, which is really not the logical thing to do.
Correct. And as a result, if that's the culture you have, people will never volunteer when they made a mistake because they know you're not with them. And then you keep hearing the truth. You have to allow people for the possibility that we all make mistakes and so do they, and be honest about it, and we learn from it and we move forward. And I'm with you. That's for me always the lesson.
No, that's very inspiring. The other thing also, right now you are kind of an investor, right? What are some of the exciting areas you're seeing in shipping right now that keeps you passionate about the shipping industry?
Yeah, this is a very, very tough one for me to answer because I never invest in shipping. If you look at the returns that you get from the shipping industry, 6, 7, 8%. Is compared to pharmaceuticals, compared to artificial intelligence, compared to retail, is a relatively low return. Of course, during my career, I was paid partly in Maersk shares, which I have kept. But I would always say, as an advice to anybody who works in the industry, never invest your own money where you earn your salary, because you always have to have a de-risking. So you invest your money elsewhere to create a buffer, because if shipping goes down and you lose your job and you have invested all your money in the same business, then you have a double whammy, right?
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned AI. That's interesting also. So what's your view on Gen AI and then the impact of AI on the industry?
It's a very difficult one. So first of all, is more than Gen AI. I mean, you mentioned large language models, but if you look at the use of artificial intelligence, particularly in the creation of models like digital twins of operations or large infrastructures or ships or ship designs, there is significant benefit to that. Some people have said that by using a digital twin in the operation of your port, you can improve productivity up to 20%. That is significant. But then you're talking digital twins, not things like ChatGPT. If you know Formula One teams like McLaren, etc., they have used digital twins for a long time to improve the performance of the race car. And that's where the technology comes from. And that's being used across the industry. I still think that is at the starting point. I think the number of players that are actively using that technology to improve their global portfolio is still very limited. There's too much old style leadership in that industry, but that's going to make a major. Then if you look at the use of large language models, then of course you see entry-level jobs disappearing that can be automated using LLMs. And that's also still happening, but is starting to have a bigger and bigger impact. On the other hand, if you look at the valuation of these AI associated companies, that is going through the roof. The question I do have, if you look at, NVIDIA being valued above 4 trillion, if you look at the S&P 500 and you see the portion of the profits and the capex and the values that consist of companies that is associated with AI, it is nearly 80%. The capex is nearly 90%. So there I am thinking, obviously AI will have a significant impact, but what kind of multiplier are we applying to the valuation of those companies to see the future benefit? McKinsey used to say, and recently even, the benefits of AI can be seen in the P&Ls of those companies, but not in the P&L of the end user yet. So if the valuation of the totality of businesses that is involved with AI is 30, 40 trillion, do we then expect 100 trillion or 300 trillion benefit in the end user? Because they're paying for that valuation. They're paying for that capex. And that multiplier is still something I cannot grasp. How we can justify these valuations in terms of end user benefit not in terms of hyperscaler capex or etc. Because that's like judging Maersk on the amount of warehousing investment they make rather than the amount of customer benefit they create. So that's for me the big outstanding question is, will AI be able to justify a multiplier on its valuation that we see today?
Yeah, there was a very interesting blog post by this investor called Jerry Newman. And then the reason it's interesting is because he basically is comparing this wave of AI to container shipping. Because he said actually Malcolm McLean, who invented container shipping and Schelling, right? They ended up not making as much money as the company who leveraged the container shipping, like such as Walmart, the retailer who were actually able to use globalization to lower the costs and to provide services, products, at a cheaper cost and have a much scaled up supply chain. So the argument was maybe the value is not for India, those guys make money, it's actually the user. That's exactly what you're saying. Right now, we're just looking at the guy building ships, building a terminal, and then say, oh, this is worth a lot of money. But actually, if the end user is not creating the value, then maybe this thing is unwarranted. Another thing you said was very interesting. I also noted that I think it was last year at TPM, in the TPM Tech presentation, there was a presentation for some researcher from Google, and they were presenting an operational research model they developed using relational algorithm for network planning. And you didn't realize that the network planning is so difficult these days with the number of vessels. I think the data set they used was the Maersk data set, that Maersk open source, I think the 600 vessel plus the constraint. And then they were basically saying that to run this at scale, it's actually not that easy to run. You can run an Excel spreadsheet. You actually need something much more robust. There's a real pocket of opportunity of optimization in the industry that most people don't understand, which is really had to do with hardcore operational research and then traditional optimization.
Absolutely, and for shipping, that is also. I mean, if you want to do that well, you should involve all the terminals in that model, and you should look at of course weather patterns, although that's relatively minor in terms of total impact. But and therefore also, if you want to improve your terminal productivity, you can use all the AI and all the digital twins that you want, but you need to involve your client in that process because ships arriving earlier or later has a big impact on your terminal productivity.
Yeah.
It's often the yard that is the
Yeah.
problem, not the water side.
Yeah. No, and I think that goes back to the Gemini Alliance, right? The project between Maersk and then Hapag-Lloyd, which is going back to change the parameters of flexibility, to change the degree of freedom, so they can optimize better at certain hub, which I think is super interesting. Because I think a lot of people in the industry conflate that to transshipment, but I think the product is quite different. Now, I may not completely agree with the logic, because I think it's changing the risk. It's different risk you're taking, but definitely it's very interesting from an operation research problem perspective, because optimization is very, very different, because you're removing some degree of freedom. Yeah. Let's move on to the last question I have. A few family, friends, son or daughter who are about to start university, like what advice would you give them? What do you think is the most interesting area for them?
So we have 4 kids, 2 of which have just graduated with a master's degree in Holland. I would say to all of them, I think it's important you do something that you love and you work for a company that you love. Most children, including myself at that age, I had no clue what I wanted. So for me, working for a company that inspires you and that you love is more important than working for a company that is big or extremely profitable or multinational or whatever. Whatever your first job in that company is actually not important, because the moment you are in, you can navigate through the waves like and I think also you need to try things out. I don't know anybody who has at age 18 decided what they want to do for the rest of their life. And nowadays also, and you know this as well, kids in their 20s don't spend their entire career with one company the way I did. Yeah, I switched, but I switched because of acquisitions, not because I quit the company and left. So I think getting that experience and finding out what truly drives you is important. And for me, yes, I joined Maersk through an acquisition. Maersk having values the way Maersk does and did, for me was important in the sense that I work for a company that believes in something, and having a sense of purpose and working for a company that believes in something, I think is a major driver for motivation. Whatever they choose a company that has purpose and that you believe in.
Yeah. Motivation is probably the most important thing, right? So it's not about the field, it's not about the area. It's like, are you motivated day in, day out to spend the energy, the time to learn, to be curious, right? To keep growing.
Exactly.
Thanks a lot for your time, Robert. It was really a good conversation. Learned quite a lot about your career at Maersk and also how Maersk people are thinking about the various strategy.
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me, Bertrand, and look forward to speaking soon.